back off, hold off for a bit. We'll regulate ourselves. We'll form a group, and they did. It's a group called the Canadian Council on Animal Care, the CCAC. When you see a title like Canadian Council on Animal Care, it sounds like it's a group that cares a lot about animals, but it's the lobby group for the people who use them in experimentation. Why they didn't use the word experimentation somewhere in the title, I don't know, but it's all about experimentation. They said, let us regulate ourselves and stay off our backs. And the federal government bought it, and that has been the situation ever since. It's what in the regulatory literature is called sort of forced regulation. It's like if you don't do a good job at it, we will step in and pass a statute. So you've got to make sure you're having some particularly high standards. But so far, the standards have been high enough so that neither the federal government nor the provinces have stepped in with a specific statute. So the CCAC regulates use of animals in experimentation here and in the local hospitals. And I think they do a not bad job. Their test isn't unnecessary suffering. It's something called the 3 R's. And those are reduce, maybe not even in the right order, reduce, replace, and refine. So basically how it works at this institution, if you want to, at Dalhousie, do an experiment, kill 100 mice to try to find a cure for cancer, you've got to go before a committee and show, number one, that animals are necessary, that you can't investigate your hypothesis without killing the mice. Number two, that you're using the minimum number necessary. And there's scrutiny for that. You say, I need to kill 1,000 mice to prove my hypothesis. The committee might say, no, you can actually prove it with 600 mice. And we're not authorizing you to use more. Replace means they will scrutinize you to see whether you can't replace animals entirely, so that people who say, I need mice to teach a class in dissection will have to prove why some of the computer programs available for that activity are not good enough. And sometimes they can't. Sometimes they say, we really need to use real mice to do this. Refine means you have to show that you're minimizing suffering in your experimental design. And it's a fairly rigorous process. Now, what I want to sort of point out in this process, you might be wondering, well, what if a given institution doesn't join in? What if they say, I just don't want to join the CCAC and be part of that? Basically, they can't, because although there's no criminal penalty for not doing so, there's a very effective hammer, and it's this. If you are not in compliance with the CCAC's approach to experimentation on animals, you're not eligible for federal funding from the primary federal government funding sources, that is the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council or the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, or any, not just for that experimentation, but the whole institution is not. So if one experimenter at Dalhousie says, I don't want to go through this process, in theory, Dalhousie gets cut off from all the funding from those federal sources, and if that happened, the lights in this room would go off in about it. You couldn't run this place for 2 minutes without transfers or research funding from those federal government sources. So there's a pretty effective compliance mechanism. Now, it still means some animals have to go through some painful experiments, and we can debate whether morally that's all right or not, but there is a fairly good test for ensuring that no more of them go through than necessary, that they're not suffering any more pain than necessary. And by and large, I would say if you had to be an experimental animal, you're a lot better off in the Dalhousie Animal Care Facility than you are in a farm. That is, you're in a bigger cage, you get better food, you get environmental enhancements, you get little toys to play with if you're a mouse. So you're not so crowded, you get the proper diet, and you get the least painful death possible, but you still die at the end. So it's not that great a deal. But for the period of time in which you're in the cage, you're better off in a Dalhousie cage than on a farm. The standards that the CCAC applies in terms of and it's quite specific how big the cages have to be and what the diet has to be. And I should say that there's a sort of separate feature. I don't want to be praising the CCAC process, but there's a separate feature to it. In addition to the vetting of individual experiments to see that they're medically necessary and with the minimum number of animals necessary to prove the hypothesis, the CCAC comes around and does tours of the facility and says things like, as it did on its last tour of Dalhousie's, you need a new ventilation system to get more fresh air for the animals. And when they say that, the university just does it. You can't say no, because all the funding disappears. So there's a system, I don't want to overly praise it, but at least when I hear people say Canada doesn't have a statute focusing on medical experimentation, and it makes it sound like we're some outlier that has no regulation at all of our experimentation, I'd say, well, we've got something else. Now, the final sort of negative comment, or that you have to make, is that hammer only works for companies that need federal funding. The universities do, the hospitals do. But what about a private company that just wants to do biomedical research for pharmaceuticals or whatever? They may not depend on federal grants. Some of them belong anyway. Some of them like to say on their websites that they're a member in good standing of the Canadian Council on Animal Care and that all the experiments that go on in their institution are subject to this fairly rigorous view. But some of them just don't care. And what goes on at them, I don't know. It just could be hell on earth for the animals there. How many of those there are, I don't know. I tend to think they're not a lot, largely because everybody says Canada doesn't do much research and development. We're just a branch plant economy anyway. But to the extent that there is some, and the companies doing it say, we don't depend on grants from the federal government, there isn't much regulation of those. And that's a problem, but so far hasn't been enough of a problem to prompt legal change. The second sort of issue, and again, a little departure from what we've done so far that I want to talk about, is an interesting development in connection with the ban that the European Union instituted on seal products and importation of seal products. Canada has challenged that under a tribunal of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. We will probably get a ruling on that before the end of the year, before Christmas. And to my mind, it will be one of the most important animal welfare-related rulings that we'll have had in a long time. Well, there will be an appeal, whichever way it goes, and it's the ruling of the appellate body when it comes, which will finally settle things, will be important. And I want to take a minute to explain why. The WTO says that you can't erect barriers to the importation, the cross-border importation of the products of other members of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that most trading nations belong to. Almost everybody does. You can't erect barriers to it. So in theory, you think the European Union can't say that Canada can't sell seal products there. It can decide for the European Union that its members can't engage in hunting and killing seals, but it shouldn't be able to keep out Canada's. But there are some exceptions to that under the GATT, the document. One relates, for instance, to health. When the BSE crisis broke out, how many years ago now in Canada, some Canadian cows tested positive for bovine spongiform encephalitis. The United Nations could ban the importation of Canadian beef, and it could get away with that because there's an exception that says, well, you can ban the importation on grounds of health. The question the question that comes up in the seal connection is, can you ban the importation on grounds of animal welfare? The European Union has wanted to say not only that its members can't hunt seals, but that Canada's not allowed to sell its seal products there. And it specifically said, that's because we think the seal hunt is cruel. It didn't try to base it on any other exception about that the seal population was threatened environmentally or that there was anything unhealthy about it. It did it because they said, and they think it's permitted under the Article 22G or whatever it is, that you could legitimately ban importation of products on animal welfare grounds. And I think that's important far beyond the seals dispute. Let me try to give an example with something that's far more important than seals in terms of dollar amounts of trade. Let's think about chickens for a second, chicken welfare. Canada says it's got regulations about the size that a chicken, when we're battery chickens, how small the cage can be. Chickens have to get, under our laws, 60 square inches. It's not very much, it's less than the size of this paper. But you can't be less than 60 square inches.